Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and I will use these, we'll give a little bit of static, quite close to the mic. Okay, it will be a little bit static performance, but this is the way it is. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk to you about ethics and information technology, a topic that has been really close to my heart for now almost 2 decades. I've started, when I was working at a philosophy department, I have started a journal that was mentioned in the introduction. It's a Springer journal, Ethics and Information Technology. It's been around for 20 years now, and it's doing well, and it's doing increasingly well. At that time, I had to defend this project to my philosophy colleagues, and they were, I was the laughing stock of the department because they said, well, it was this is the 20 years ago, and they said, the computer, that's a little bit of a fashion. How do you think that will be an important philosophical topic? So, but I'm glad that I continued with that work, and now it's a venue and a platform for people who are really concerned about the ethical and societal impact of computers and information technology, and as I said, it's doing well. I would like to talk to you about the importance of design and designing for values, because I think that is a way of talking and conceptualizing ethics and IT that overcomes a gap. The gap between, on the one hand, a very high level and very nice discussion about ethical issues, and on the other hand, the technical work that you are so familiar with on the other hand. And there is the danger that there is a nice discussion here and that we leave everything as it is, and then we go off and do our technical work on the other hand, and it's not informed, it's not influenced by our ethical discussions. I think this way of thinking about ethics as a design challenge helps us to overcome that gap. And I will dish that out in 2 parts. I will first talk about how important IT and design is, actually from a moral point of view, so the ethical significance of that. And then the second part is I will go into this design for values, how you do it, what the state of the art is in the thinking about that. I will discuss a problem of moral overload, and I will discuss responsible innovation, which has become a central topic also for the EU. I have headed up a committee that advised the European Commission on how to think about ethics and legal and social issues in Horizon 2020, and I'm glad to report that they have taken this on board and actually are investing over the course of 10 years, as you know, out of this 80 billion, they will spend 500 million exclusively on responsible innovation, which is the new label for doing ethics in the applied science and engineering domain in the European area. So first, ethics and information technology. We're almost forgetting, it's so obvious that it is about information, and information is incredibly important good for people in deciding about their lives, about where to put your children to school, where to have an open heart surgery, which jobs to take, where to buy property, etc. So information is garbage in, garbage out. People will take bad decisions if they have poor information or no information at all. These terms refer to information technology is everywhere, so it's about a very crucial good, and the technology that deals with it is everywhere, right? And I want to draw your attention to 3 other properties which I think are morally very significant. That IT is constitutive, it's confusing, and it's value-laden. And together they form a case that makes the point that it's really morally, from a moral point of view, very important. Well, people are so excited about IT, and usually they express this excitement by saying it is an enabler. It's a wonderful enabler. It allows us to do things faster, to store more information. So the things that we could do, it now allows us to do much better and faster and more efficient. But people forget that it's also a constitutive technology, that it constitutes, it's not only the icing on the cake or the cherry on the cake, it is the cake itself, it is the dough itself. If you import it in a hospital, into science, into public administration, into politics, the procedures and the nature of the thing to which it is applied will change. So ICT shapes the practices, the discourses and institutions to which it is applied. Never assume that things will remain unchanged or marginally change. The other thing is that it is confused. Most of the time we're confused. If you look at this list, democracy, trust, privacy, property, community, person, intelligence, this reads as the table of contents of a philosophy book, right? And well, one of the characteristics of these notions is that we use them to think about societies, about our lives. They are cornerstones in our designing our societal institutions, our political systems, etc. But one characteristic is that they are essentially contested. Essentially contested means that there is always controversy over the meaning of those terms. Actually, controversy over the meaning of those words is part and parcel of the meaning. So if people stick up their finger and say, I have the right definition of democracy or person, then they've got it all wrong, because they ignore the fact that we should discuss together which conception is the most adequate for a particular purpose. So, what has this to do with IT? Well, this is the situation now. IT only makes it more confused. Now we talk, here we're already pretty confused. These are philosophical notions, and they have, some people have also remarked, they're only essentially contested. They have the Augustinian property. The Augustinian property is that, you know, St. Augustine said about time, if you don't ask me, I know what time is, but if you ask me for a definition, I don't know what it is. Well, that applies here. IT only complicates the matters, because now, and you could do permutations in all directions, you know, it doesn't matter. We have friendships or net friendships, digital persons, we have, you know, but we're here already confused. This is only adding to the confusion. And for a philosophical discussion, that is not that bad, because we open another bottle of red wine and we continue the conversation. But here we have to come up with technical solutions. We have to devise laws and policies and come up on a day-to-day basis with solutions to our problems. And then it's very nasty if you're confused, because the only thing you're saying if you're using those terms is actually, oh, I want to talk about a cyber community. It's a new sort of community. It's a new sort of friendship. You know, when your children come home and they say, I've got 1,000 friends, you say, oh, really? You're using, obviously, a different definition of friendship. So it's a placeholder. You're taking out a mortgage on an analysis which you still have to supply in the future. You're for a moment, you're puzzled. And that's a very bad basis you're in a conceptual vacuum, and therefore you're in a policy vacuum, and therefore you're in a design vacuum. How can you think about the architecture or a system if you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to these terms? So this is something, and now I want to go to the last characteristic of ICT, that it is value-laden. This is an example from outside IT. Something has obviously gone wrong. You can still see these things. It's Brooklyn, New York. What has happened here is this is a low-hanging overpass. They were designed by an architect and town planner, Robert Moses, in the beginning of the previous century. He was a famous guy. He did a lot of big infrastructural projects. What happened here is he designed them, and the people who were working at that time on these things reported that. They say, these are lower than we usually do them. Right? Is that okay? Yeah, it was okay, because it was intentionally done this way. To do what? Well, to make sure that the buses from the poor black neighborhoods could not be routed by the transport company to the white middle class beaches. This is a racist, low-hanging overpass. It functions as a barrier. Right? It has a value, in this case a racist value, embedded in it. It is expressed in a piece of civil engineering. And this is a crude piece of engineering, but once you've seen this, you will realize that this is happening everywhere where people design stuff. They design it with their worldview or their assumptions, with their values in the back of their mind, and it will get expressed into an artifact, whether it's a digital or an electronic artifact or a system or whatever. It will get expressed there, and from there it will start to constrain the future users. And this is something that we need to bear in mind. So, information technology is about a crucial good. The technology is everywhere. We're confused about it. It's constitutive, and it is value-laden. So this is one argument for the moral importance of IT. There are many examples of, value-ladenness. This is another case. Electronic, this digitized images in hospitals and repositories for the data. This was the old situation. This is the new situation. Here people stood around the X-rays and looked at them and discussed amongst themselves. It was very useful epistemic practice, so to say. This is the new situation: high resolution, cheap image viewers, and a repository for digitized images. And now people will look at them in isolation and then have a conversation with their colleagues. That's another way of, it's reverting the work process. I'm not saying that this is wrong. It's something that you should be aware of when you do it, right? When you introduce IT into the hospital. This is a very nice example of, let's do a real-time audio-video link on the helmet of the people of the fire brigade, and so they can benefit from the advice of an emergency medicine center, which is available 24/7. Great idea, and from an IT point of view, this experiment was done, immaculate, without any problems, within budget, according to the requirements, but it failed at the first attempt. Why? Well, not the smoke, not the technical thing, it was an ethical thing. Because it was assumed that the people from the fire brigade and the medical people were on the same level. They had the same definition of their responsibilities. But the medical people would say, now you have to apply a gel pack to the arm of this boy, whereas the people from the fire brigade said, I have 5 people in the adjacent building. I now have to apply foam to that building. So it started to interfere, those conceptions of their obligations and the professional responsibilities. So this could be a perfect IT project. It couldn't work if you hadn't addressed in first instance how to deal with these conflicts of obligations. So start with that, or at least make that part of your thinking about the architecture, and then start to design for it. So that's an example. Of course, we know there's bias in search engines. The formula that killed Wall Street, it comes with values and assumptions built into it. There's a nice article in. So values are built into systems, in interfaces, infrastructures, algorithms, the choice of your ontologies, code, everywhere, right? But also the more social items in socio-technical systems, procedures, incentive structures, auction mechanisms, all these are the result of choices that have been made. Together they're put together, and together they constrain users or they empower users, and both of them. And we need to find out how. So the key problem, or the ground structure, is what we call value-sensitive design, or designing for values. This is the world of ethics, values, norms, and they have an ethical direction, a fit. The world should be adjusted in accordance with these things. They have an ought direction of fit, and this is kind of obeying what we think is important here. Of course, we want to do a good job, and we want to express and implement in the things that we make and design the right things, not the racist values, but the right values, the values that we share. And that is, of course, a whole problem in itself. We're not going to solve that. That remains in place. That is an ethical problem. But in any case, we need to be clear of how to contextualize this in the context of IT. And then once we've done that, we need to explain and justify and audit, actually, that we've done a good job in designing these things here, the world of engineering, software engineering, on the basis of these requirements, which are not your typical standard technical requirements, functional requirements, but they are non-functional or supra-functional requirements. And it's very important that we are able, and that we teach and learn our future generation of engineers, software engineers and other engineers, to think about, right from the start, in terms of those non-functional requirements, so that we can do a better job here. So the moral importance of IT environments, a couple of inroads, different ways using different bodies of literature to say the same thing, basically. Just very briefly. They are choice architectures. I assume that you are vaguely familiar, or very much familiar with this work on nudging. Many of our presidents and political leaders have nudging teams. They help them to suggest to the citizens how they should behave, to wear their safety belts, to have a healthier diet, to have more exercise, etc. Not to take away options from them, not to interfere with their liberty, but just make them behave, make it more likely that they will behave in the directions that are preferred from the political point of view. So this is Obama's former advisor. He's written this book, Nudge, Cass Sunstein, and he talks about these choice architectures. And these are all choice architectures. It's a way of lining up choices for users. Right? And so you can structure that in all kinds of ways. And so a nudge is an aspect of a choice architecture that alters behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options. So you could arrange the food in your canteen in such a way that the deep fried unhealthy stuff is in the back and your tomatoes and your healthy stuff is up front. So it will make it, is the idea, more likely that people will pick the healthy stuff and not stretch to get the unhealthy stuff, right? And the choice architect is the one who devises and designs these choice architectures. The architect has a responsibility for organizing the context in which people make those decisions. So designers are choice architects. And bear in mind, there is no such thing as a neutral design, and even apparently insignificant details can have major impacts. So we're asking people who are designing choice architectures to reflect upfront about what the impacts are to the extent that they can. This is an example of persuasive technology. You may come across this. It started at Schiphol Airport. So yeah, it's more likely that people will behave and don't make a mess of it, but all the degrees of freedom are still there. So this is the speed bump, also to remind us of you can drive over it with 100 kilometers an hour, but if once you've tried that, you will next time you will think twice. So our choices are manipulated by the choice architectures that are designed by other people. That's something really. So that's one way of putting it. The other way of making the same point of how important that IT environment is, and our whole society is an IT environment, is to use the work of David Chalmers, who's a philosopher of mind. Here he is. He's one of the most prominent philosophers of mind. He's an Australian, but working also in Princeton. And he has written together with Andy Clark on extended minds. And they refer to that work also under the label of Wideware Engineering. So there is the software, there's the hardware, there is even the wetware, but there is also the wideware. And so the point they are making is that epistemic action, we suggest, demands spread of epistemic credit. If, as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, were it done in the head, we would have no hesitation in recognizing it as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world, so we claim, is part of that cognitive process. Why would we draw the boundary of a cognitive system at where our skull is, right? So it could protrude and extend into the environment. I'm using all these clever and intelligent devices to sustain me, to support me in carrying out my tasks, so it's part of that. The way they illustrate this or demonstrate that is the thought experiment of Otto, the Alzheimer patient. So if you put Otto in the fMRI scan, it appears that it's all gone. You know, you would expect this person to be in bed and not be able to get around. But lo and behold, if you visit him in his apartment, he seems to be able to get around, you know, perfectly all right. And you study his environment, and it turns out that he has left sticky notes everywhere with little arrows pointing at certain things to remind him, books, notebooks open. So he has redesigned his whole environment, and together in interaction with his environment, he can sustain himself and live a reasonable, decent life. So it is that wider context, that wideware engineering that he has been so successful in, that allows him to sustain himself and to get around. Now, I am not interested in the ontological or metaphysical claim that these guys are making. I'm not so much, you know, if Frank and I use the same laptop, do we have the same mind? I'm not so much interested. I'm interested in the moral implications of this. Because further to this thought experiment, suppose that someone would sneak into the apartment and he would make a mess of all the arrows and close the notebooks and switch the sticky notes. That would be on the same level. It would be a very devious and nasty thing to do. And it would be on the level, morally, as tampering with someone's brain, right? You can see how incredibly important that design of the environment is in where people have to carry out their duties, their tasks, and to sustain themselves. And it is IT professionals who are responsible for the design, that wideware engineering, and creating the context in which people have to sustain themselves and have to carry out and discharge their obligations and take their responsibilities. So this is another way of saying it. It's choice architectures, it's the design of the wideware, wideware engineering, and the other way of saying the same thing, this is the third way of saying that thing, is going back to this trolley problem. You've come across this This example probably, do you know this trolley? How many people are familiar with this trolley problem? Not so many. Okay, so the trolley problem is a little cart comes down the hill, you're here or someone else is here at the lever. If you don't do anything, the cart will go here, the trolley will hit those 5 people tied to the track, and now you can switch the lever and make the trolley go in this direction. And you have to believe me, you know, the amount of literature and analysis that philosophers have spent on this is, you know, it's amazing. This is classical stuff in your first year, easily 1 semester, you know, 20 books by most prominent professors from the Ivy League universities, all about the trolley problem. I won't go into the trolley problem. I use it for a particular reason. The reason is if you explain this to engineers, and we do that in our teaching, then they say, bad design, right? And of course, in a philosophy seminar, that is a stupid remark, because you're not supposed to wriggle and change the, you know, the thought experiment. This is the reason why we have this thought experiment, because they want to tease out all the intuitions that are behind it and make it really difficult on you. But the engineers say bad design. I would make this, you know, a break at the same time, so that you would be able to prevent this tragic situation. You could stop the trolley here, right? Or I would make, you know, a sensor system that would signal that people were in touch with the track, etc. An automatic braking system. So these engineers are actually doing railway track design themselves. Why? They want to do a better job in order to prevent this. The philosophers, of course, they are just interested in these kind of theoretical examples. And when you think about it, it is pretty unfair to that person who is in that situation to ask, are you responsible? What would you do? Because that person is framed in this infrastructure. And this is the reason why the engineers say, well, you know, you're designed in this situation, you're part of that, and now you're confronted with a choice that has been imposed upon you between A and B. You would have liked to do something else, but that other option, C, was not designed in, right? Of course, from an academic philosophical point of view, very interesting. But if we want to learn about responsibilities in a high-tech society, we need to take the design history into account, because that is where the choices have been made, the choice architectures, the wideware, the systems design, in which people are then framed. And that is really important to extend our notion of responsibility and theorizing about responsibility, to take a historical perspective, and especially with respect to the design history of this. So users and operators are framed by the design, the responsibility is a function of the design, and a set of affordances and constraints is imposed upon their agency. That is why it is so very important to think from a moral point of view about IT, and to make it a reductio ad absurdum, right, is to say, oh, let's talk about the responsibility of Sophie in the story of Sophie's choice, where she has to make a choice between picking one of her children to be killed, and otherwise both of them will be killed, and say, well, what is her responsibility? What should she do, right? That is an insane kind of discussion, because there is a perverse choice architect that lines up those choices and puts her in that particular position. So summarizing, IT is everywhere, it is conceptually confusing, it's constitutive, it's value-laden, and the IT context can be characterized in terms of choice architectures, wideware, and responsibility frames, and we have to take that on board. Now, what is part of the, by the way, Weizenbaum already kind of put this in his wonderful book that needs to be reread, I think, Computer Power and Human Reason. Designers need to have the most profound awareness that their products are the result of human choices, and that they will affect human choices. And it's here, everywhere, that is very pertinent and relevant. If we now look at where ethics is, what the state of the art of ethics research is, apart from the trolleyology, right? I've referred to it as trolleyology. Ethics has now become very empirical. And one of the things is that we found out is that the good and the bad people are normally distributed. So you always have the 10% of the people who always want to share their sandwich with you, and you know, it's never too late to give them a call and to ask them to help you. And there are the people who are, you know, always looking out for number one. And so that's the way it is. But in the middle, there are the people who do what? Do the right or the good thing, we found out on the basis of a lot of empirical research, according to the situation. The situation matters a lot, and therefore the design of the systems environment which we design, you design, other people design, is important to either support them as moral agents or not. So a lot of those examples, it matters whether your screensaver is a pair of eyes or a bunch of flowers, whether you will be honest or not, or you will be cheating in tests. Whether it smells very nice in your office, or you have a clean desk. It all is important for helping behavior, giving people directions, changing their money in the street. All of these things matter. Let me see how much time I still have. Yeah. So, for example, the Princeton theology, we know the Milgram experiments, of course, we know the Stanford prison, if you say that people are a group of people, students is the boss of some others, then they will start to behave accordingly. And these experiments have to be stopped after 2 days because it's really becoming really nasty. So people are behaving, if you tell children in the morning when they come into class that the children with the brown eyes are the boss of the people with the blue eyes, then it's getting out of hand fairly soon. And if you change that the next day, it's no different. So I won't go into all of these. But the Princeton theology is interesting. You have a bunch of theology students in Princeton that study for 1 week, the Good Samaritan. And so they have to do all kinds of, and they have to do a presentation at the end of that week about the Good Samaritan. And you frame it in such a way that they're bound to be too late for their presentation. So they're rushing to their, across campus with their USB stick to their presentation. Princeton theology students have been thinking and working on the Good Samaritan, and you send someone who is confused and needs assistance on their way. 80% of them, what do you expect that they do? They push these people aside and say, sorry, I have to do my presentation. Right, so it is the way the situation is framed that will make us behave in particular ways. So as Churchill, I think, interestingly said when he was commenting on the renovation of the Houses of Parliament, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. We design our digital society and our digital environment, and thereafter it starts to shape us. So we're indirectly shaping ourselves, and we need to bear that in mind. So we need to learn to design for our values, the things that we hold dear, we think are important. Our life world is digital and designed, and it constitutes intransparently confused and value-laden our choice architectures, wideware environments, and responsibility frames. Now, how can we do that? Well, this is what we already said. Somehow we have to make it possible to use these moral considerations and values as non-functional requirements, which we can sneak into a list in a quite early stage, into a list of requirements that engineers are working with. And once we've done so, we also have to justify and audit this. Together with a bunch of people across the world, University of Washington, we are working to do this type of research, to do cases, to develop the methodology. And we had a workshop in Aarhus this summer on what's the next decade of designing for values and making them effectively bear upon the design work that we do. In Delft, we are starting now the designforvalues.org initiative. So she says, value-sensitive design requires that we broaden the goals and criteria for judging the quality of technological systems to include those that advance human values. And I've come from the ethics angle, and design for values is a way of doing ethics, right? Ethics cannot just be left there on a fairly high level of abstraction, a very nice discussion that we have with coffee and a glass of wine, and then go off and everything remains the same. We have to make this effectively bear upon our design work. And I think if we do that, we have more transparency, accountability, trust, legitimacy, user acceptance, and all kinds of moral qualities, and do a particular type of innovation, which I will say more about. So it's about proactivity, using ethics as non-functional requirements, engineering, and adopt a design stance. So roughly start with high-level values, because this is what politicians, journalists, the audience, the population at large talks about. They talk about privacy and accountability and all of these things. Specify them in terms of more specific norms, and then into design requirements. And this we do in Delft, across all engineering schools. It can be done also for animal welfare, and say, well, what do you mean by animal welfare? Well, this is a kind of functional decomposition of non-functional requirements. Animal welfare, well, that means enough living space. What does enough living space mean? Well, we can talk about, quantification and operationalization of that. And now we have a tractable moral problem, because we can point our finger and say, well, where do you disagree? For sure not here, for sure not there. Well, perhaps here. And then we get a little bit of a structured ethical debate, whereas usually we were just talking about privacy, scary, or I have nothing to hide. We have to get away from that type of discussions. We have to make it tractable by being more specific. You could even say those ethical debates are gratuitous if you leave them on that high level of abstraction, because you're not helping anyone in doing a better job in designing systems, laws, and policies. Right? So we do that kind of stuff. The great benefit of that is you get a little bit, for the first time in history, you get a little bit of an empirical cycle in ethics going. Because it used to be the case that we wrote a constitution and then we designed society to be in accordance with that constitution, and then we had to wait 200 years for a revolution to occur and redraft the constitution. And now what you have, you design your system, you have your user experiences, you see how it works, and you go back to your starting points and see whether you've implemented them in the right way. So you get this in a very agile and kind of, even by rapid prototyping these things, but looking at the moral quality of this. So we have to learn to design for X, where X ranges over a number of moral values, right? Designing for privacy, security, inclusion. We've got a handbook there, 1,000 pages, where we give you the cases, some of the methodology, some of the literature, everything you've always wanted to know about this stuff, and it's there. Now the problem is, it's very nice to have all of those values, right? But you will get stuck in conflicts of those values. They're always in tension with each other. And that's the problem of moral overload. We're constantly morally overloaded. You want to do and sustainability and privacy and safety and security and all of that stuff. So value pluralism and non-relativism. We're not inclined to say, well, let's skip that one, or let's skip human dignity for a moment, or let's skip sustainability for the moment. No, we need to do all of that stuff, in addition to the technical and functional requirements, right? So there is always conflict and dilemmas. Now, look at a case, not an IT case, where it went wrong. This is a sustainable, unsafe bus. It exploded near The Hague, optimized on one value, moral value, sustainability. Very light, aluminium, carbon fiber, liquid gas, bang, right? Forgotten about the safety. So we need to do and. Here, a little bit of a problem here. Cheating your way out of the problem of moral overload, pretending that you have solved it, but not really, right? So this is a good case to work on in this context, about being transparent about the values that have been built into your software. The problem of moral overload is you want prosperity, jobs, and sustainability. You want security and privacy, efficiency and safety, accountability and confidentiality. So look at two Dutch cases where we missed out and we messed up. Because if you don't do this well, you miss out and you mess up. Smartify the grid. If we want to reach our CO2 reduction targets in Europe in 2020, we have to smartify the grid to do load balancing and peak shaving. Great job. So we have to supply every household with a smart meter. Great idea. Everyone was ready to roll. 5 years of research, everyone was ready to invest its money, and then we had a privacy discussion in the Netherlands. And it was rejected by the upper house. So the whole plan, back to square one, hundreds of millions of loss, and of course, not reaching our sustainability goals. Why? Well, because this thing could have been better. The engineers claimed they did a smart meter. Well, it was not that smart that it accommodated those privacy concerns to the fullest possible extent. So again, if we would have taken these kind of debates, harvested the moral considerations and actually made them part of the design of that smart meter, the smart meter could have been a better product. It could have been also, from a moral point of view, a better thing. Same thing for electronic patient record systems. In the Netherlands, 300 million failed innovation. Same thing, rejected by the upper house because of privacy problems. I've spoken to the people who were responsible for this system 10 years ago. They said they had spoken to all the consumer organizations, to all the patient organizations, but it was a routine matter. They didn't really wanted to do a good job from this moral point of view, I claim. If they would have done so, it would have been a much better infrastructure. So what's the structure of the problem? We want our sustainability, and we will also want privacy. Or you want, think about the camera systems in the streets. Yeah. You want your privacy and you want your security, right? So this is the problem of moral overload. You want your privacy above a certain threshold level, and you want your security above a certain threshold level. But usually we're stuck with a first generation stupid camera system that neither gives you privacy nor security. It gives you razor-sharp images of innocent citizens and blurred images of the crooks. That's not very helpful. Or you have a second-generation camera system, which is much better, and you hang it everywhere, you have a lot of security. Or you don't hang it everywhere, you have a lot of privacy but no security. What you, of course, want is you want a really smart camera system, one that is so sophisticated that you can tweak it so that you can have the advantages, the security advantages, without the privacy problems. And that will bring you into this ideal right upper hand square of your ideal moral solutions, where you have your cake and eat it. You have squared the circle, so to speak, from a moral point of view. And that is, in this direction, there are a lot of innovations, and you could, any conflicting values you could replace here, and so innovations are exactly the urge to get out of here and to transform the world in such a way that now suddenly you can satisfy both of your obligations. This is the end. And the logicians under you may recognize this name, Ruth Barkin Marcus. She had this, I think, a very pertinent observation. If there is an obligation to do both A and B, then we have a second order obligation to see to it that we can do both A and B. So think back about the trolley problem. There you are, you want to do A and B, and someone else in the recent past could have done something to change that situation so that you could have done both A and B, right? Save lives of all the people there. And that's exactly what the engineering response was. I could have done a better job. I could have changed it in such a way that this tragic dilemma was prevented from occurring in the first place. So if a contingent state of the world at time t1 doesn't allow us to satisfy two or more of our moral values or moral obligations at the same time, but we can bring about change by innovation in the world at t1 that allows us to satisfy them all together at a later time t2, then we have a moral obligation to innovate at t1. Or short, if you can change the world by innovation today so that you can satisfy more of your obligations tomorrow, you have a moral obligation to innovate today. And that's exactly what we do when we do responsible innovation. This is where I mentioned in the beginning, the European Commission is investing in this. This is just getting out of that lock, that kind of where you have to do or privacy or security. And of course there are many examples, and you will recognize them, but I think this is underlying it. So the Dutch Fairphone, conflict-free tin and tantalum, dual SIM, replaceable battery, e-waste program, worker welfare, routable operating system. The design accommodates all of those requirements. I've got more examples. You do, mobile data center, put it very close to glass houses. Excess heat is used to heat up this. This is an innovation prize. Put the servers in the basements of Dutch churches, which are used to run conferences and not for religious ceremonies. You heat this and you cool that. So privacy enhancing technologies in general. A good case, I'm running out of time, so we'll skip this, but this is not a non-IT example, but Germany in the last decades was confronted with this political tension which is dividing the nation, Green Party and economic progress. So how can we do it? Well, basically now so this is the tension between the sustainability and economic growth. Germany is market leader in sustainability technology, and it is not because they made it easy on themselves. They could make it easy on themselves. They had to confront both of these things, and they had to innovate themselves out of it. So they had to think of a clever solution. Same with all kinds of zero visions, zero road traffic accidents in Sweden, zero emissions, zero preventable children dying. That is a way of expressing that you will not compromise on one of those values. Actually, you're seeing that as a challenge and an encouragement to think of a way to transforming the world so that you can do all of those things at the same time. So Volvo is doing a lot of that. Sensor technology. First they made the car into a tank, very safe for the driver, not so very safe for the pedestrians. Then they did the sensor technology also to make it more safe for other people. Now they've realized that their crash dummies are male, and they realize that there are also pregnant women who need to be protected. So you won't get to these kind of innovations if you don't care about, really take serious your safety or the kind of well-being of the people who are driving the car, or anyone for that matter. So I'm claiming that ethics will also help and drive innovation. Moral values as drivers of innovation, transforming the world by design so that we can respect more of our obligations and responsibilities than before, which is basically a conception of moral progress. If we move from a situation where we can satisfy only one of our obligations, as in a tragic dilemma, to a situation where we can satisfy two, we've amplified the set of obligations that we can satisfy, which is the definition of moral progress. And it's done, and arguing contra my philosophy colleagues who would be construe this as a way of cheating yourself out of the problem by a technical fix. I think this is very interesting to look at. So I would recommend for 2025 learning to articulate moral values in these IT contexts, perspicuously represent our moral values, anticipate the problems as much as we can by front-loading ethics, by doing what you could call moral requirements engineering to beget more transparency, accountability, legitimacy, trust, and eventually to make the digital world a better place. That's what I had to share with you.
Now, let me start with this slide. I know who of you has noticed, it was just a few weeks ago that Symantec announced that they had to fire a few people. Why? Because they issued certificates for Google to access Google servers as if it was Google servers, but it wasn't. Now, if you think about that, I wonder why this didn't pop up much more in the news. Because what does it mean? It means that someone can tell who is who. Someone can impersonate you, and that can happen. This time it popped up. Maybe it doesn't pop up all the time. Maybe there might be some intention around that. And if you look into the legislations of the various countries, which are very incompatible, that would give you a few thoughts. Now, this is what I will be talking this afternoon over the next 45 minutes. That's what I was asked to. And basically, it is about jurisdiction-aware ID. What does it mean? If we are communicating today, if we're sending packets over the internet, we don't know where these packets go. They are transiting various jurisdictions. And at the end, if we have a problem, what to apply? Was it legal? It might well be legal. Just think about switching mobile connections. If I call, for example, Mr. Wertner, on the same telephone company, it might well be that this phone call is switched in Nigeria. It might well be realistic that it's switched in Slovenia or Turkey. Now, think about what that means in terms of interception. There are totally different laws in these countries, and even if the company tells him and me, we will never intercept your call. We will not allow the Austrian jurisdiction to intercept the call unless there is a court order. That might be groundless unless we have a jurisdiction over our communication. And with this regard, we can go much further in thinking, and we have to think about that, and I will elaborate that a little bit. A third point is push notification. Yeah. Who is using WhatsApp? Well, at least a few, but most of you are using Skype and other things. Did you think that everyone in this situation who has a smartphone, and I think if I ask who has a smartphone, we have all hands up, is every time connected with an open IP connection to either Google, Microsoft, or Apple? Now, what they can do over this connection is at least very interesting. I don't know how deep you are in communications, but many of you are roaming around. When you are doing roaming, you get a long SMS. And this long SMS is reconfiguring your mobile phone, and it will behave totally different depending on where you are. Now, who has thought about that this long SMS is not authenticated? If I have a small box in here, which looks to you as if you were roaming somewhere, I could send you a reconfiguration with your mobile phone. Now, what happens to your call? Now, you see what this legal dimension means, and this is very important that we observe that. Now, we have all heard about cloud storage. That is up on the air anyway, at least now as we have this safe harbor discussion, which might or might not help. We will see. It's a dimension it's of a dimension that we cannot see that it will change anything at all, because it's going just everywhere. Now, for example, we have universities in Austria that are using Google Mail. Well, obviously this is painted to be illegal by this safe harbor, by making safe harbor obsolete. And we have other things like, if an official institution is using Office 365 or Google Docs, it's the same thing. It's not observing the jurisdictional environment. When it comes to document collaboration, like an Office 365 or Google Docs, that is going one dimension further. In cloud, you're transferring files from your computer to the cloud, then you're using, etc., etc. When you're using document collaboration, you are on the air, you are in the internet as you type. Each character, each wrong written character, I didn't want to do that, and that doesn't even need collaboration. If you're using just an online platform to edit documents, which most probably will be the case very soon, or the obvious case very soon, because of pricing reasons, etc., etc. Certificate updates is a very interesting thing. What do you trust when you have an Apple computer, when you have a PC? You trust what your vendor tells you. And do you know that within 18 hours, Microsoft can change the trust chain of every single computer in the world, except for a few, except for those in China. Why in China? China has a policy that they do not accept update in a direct mode. They have a chain mode, which means you have two gates, the update comes in, then they close the second gate so that they can have a look at the update, and then they will release it to the country. They have to do that within 2 weeks. That's the agreement with Microsoft. Well, that's something very interesting. So if you're powerful enough, you can play against those big players as well. But at the end, what is at stake? At stake is the balance between a state-driven, a jurisdiction, society-driven model, which we hope is democratic, at least in our areas is democratic, and a model which is driven by huge companies, where there is no feedback from societies, feedback from money, which is different. Money is not society, not all is only society. Now, we have seen this safe harbor situation, which changes very many things. It doesn't only change cloud computing, it changes many collaboration agreements, and I would think that everyone in this room, including me, is using something where you have to think about what is happening here. And well, we have to act in one or the other way. And indeed, the reason is about cloud. The reason is about cloud, it's about security, it's about mobile devices. Why is it about cloud? Because cloud is an instrument for big companies to concentrate services, to bind users in a more, in a stricter way to their model than they have been able to do so far. I'm not against cloud, I'm using cloud all the time, but you have to be aware of that. And we had a working group on the European level, which was chaired by the president of Estonia, Mr. Ilves, also Ms. Cruz was in there. We were about 14 people where we discussed all this stuff. And it's very interesting. And one of the things which comes out, it's about electronic identity. Everything which is about security, everything which is about securing your perimeter, it's about identity. And we have lots of challenges in the future. It's not about storage only. Storage is obvious, but it's, as I said, document collaboration. It's about web services. So far, we are only authenticating the server in one or the other way, but we are not used to have something like client certificates. We are not used to have something like both ends to be identified, which might be interesting if you think that someone is playing you. And that's not so obvious. That's not so obvious, and I will come back to that later on. We have to cope with a variety of devices like tablets, handies, laptops, PCs, and various makes, which has one good thing. It raises the levels of abstraction. Everything has to go through browser, HTML5, what have you. But it has also the effect that many things are not feasible because they don't work through all the palette. Unless we use identification in a proper way, and unless we use signature and encryption, and unless we have a good model which views that in terms of separating the security from the service, we will not match our needs. And for this, EID is the basis of any sovereignty, and we have to observe that there has been some evolution over the last years and months. In the European Union, we have, as of July last year, coming into force finally July 2016, the EIDAS regulation, which means it's not anymore the member state doing all this legislation. It's a law which is immediately effective on a EU level. And for example, in Austria, we will have to get rid of many legislation pieces, like most of the signature law, like most of other, many parts of other laws, because it's just not legal to regulate that on the national level. It's regulated on an EU level. And to some extent, data protection will go the same way. It will go a little slower because it's not so strict a matter like EID. But one thing we have to observe, EIDAS, the regulation, assigns the responsibility about the identity to the member state. The member state has to be under control, it has to do supervision, and it's liable for. So if something happens in Portugal about EID, the Austrian can call Portugal. Anyone who is concerned can call up the state of Portugal to take under supervision and to do the appropriate things. This is nothing technology in cloud has recognized as yet. Whether it's Google, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Asia, whether it's somewhere else, they deem themselves to be the master of the EID. And if they allow identification on other means, it's always secondary, which means you can use some EID to federate into the EID of the cloud service provider. Now, what does liability, what does responsibility mean in that context? We have to be very careful about that, and I think they need to adjust to comply with the technical and legal requirements, as they have to adjust to comply with the result of things like the safe harbor decision. There is no security without identity, which is obvious. If you are defending interests of someone, the only way is that you know who is this person. And unless you know who is this person or who is this entity, it might be a legal entity, it might not be a physical person, it's obsolete. And that means that we need at least quality identification, which means multi-factor identification, which means crypto-based identification. Well, clouds are far away. You know, even if you look at advanced principles, you find things like long strings, but they are constant. And if somebody spies on you and gets out these strings, which is not complicated, just think you're using your cloud service on an airport, in an airport or internet cafe terminal, I could install something which gets onto your secret. And probably that happens. And we need things that are robust against this, which are robust against replaying playing again the same scenario. It just has to be obsolete. You have spent it, you have spent the identification, you need a new one, and crypto serves for that. But it has to be simple enough for users. Unless the user broadly accepts that, we will not succeed. We will not succeed that this is to some extent the state of the art, that this is an order of services. And that's our goal. Now, the IDAS regulation is more or less compulsory for the public sector. I'm saying more or less it's compulsory for all qualified services in the public sector. So if you're saying, I don't care, you know, if this is the timetable of Wiener Linien or what have you, well, it's even open, it's without identification. But if it's on a very low level, you can say, I don't care about. But if it's something you have to protect, like medical, like fiscal, at least in our area, it might be different in other member states, like in the northern ones, in all these cases, when you declare this is quality identification, then you have to be interoperable, you have to use this regulation, which is a great challenge for all the levels of administrations in the months and years to come. Now, when has this started? This has started, and we are proud of that, during the Austrian presidency 2006, and I remember that I negotiated with the Commission the large-scale pilot, as it was called, which is sort of something which melted into the Horizon 2020. And it was, a singular project that demonstrated that member states and systems could interoperate. And one of these three first pilots was the Stork project, which assumed at least the minimum level of security, which was aimed at mutual recognition so that you can go cross borders. And at least in Austria, since 2010, we have a legal provision which says that we have to accept any ID technology which has a certain level of security to our services, no matter where it comes from, as long as it comes from inside the EU. And in reality, you can use your Portuguese, you can use your Luxembourg, you can use your Estonian, you can use your what have you. identification means, which in many cases is the ID card. In Austria, we don't have ID cards on a broad use because there's no need to have one. Only 10% of Austrians own an ID card. Therefore, we switched to other technologies like the e-health card and the mobile phone. And it's an interoperability protocol which has been developed in Stork, which is more or less the thing which comes into the eIDAS regulation. It was designed for administration and private sector, but some of the member states were not ready to make it in a way that the private sector can take full profit of in terms of liability, etc., etc. It's promoted for the private sector. Private sector is asked to use it, so it has the basis, but it could be integrated in a better way. Now, the challenges and the attacks are not only on this on the software level. Here's just one. I'm just flashing out one or the other. You certainly have heard about this bad USB. It's around since long time, which is a very simple concept. Basically every PC or every workstation accepts a keyboard on the USB. Now, if you embed in a normal USB stick a very intelligent keyboard, that can do a lot of harm. And that's basically the idea of bad USB. So it's not a malware or anything. You cannot really detect it because it's doing more or less regular usage, but probably in a way you didn't intend that to have. And well, at least we are not assumed to take USB stick gifts for certain reasons, at least not for official use. I spoke about cloud in many ways, and we have to be careful that the concepts we have achieved do not fade away with cloud. And I'm only pointing up on a few. In cloud services, it becomes even more complicated and more crucial that users and services need to know the jurisdiction data is in rest, in transit, and where it goes. Now, what does this, again and again, at least 5 times as I count, mentioned this jurisdiction-aware communication. What does it mean in practice? It means in practice that we have a tool which tells us at the very point in time when a packet is communicated, where this packet has traveled through. I'll get back to that on the next slide. Users and services must make sure that they are the only ones that have access to data, which is not at all obvious and technologically a very high challenge, at least if you say the user has to be the only one who has access to the service, because the research is not yet there. There are concepts, and I will come back to that, that foster that, enable that to a certain extent, but in general it's not feasible. And we have many things which are not solved at all. Let me give you a very simple example. Assume, countries I mentioned are like fantasy. Assume we have a service in Denmark. And assume Romania, the government of Romania is using that service. And now this service is an open cloud service, and you have also companies using that. And for one or the other reason, the Danish police and judges come to the decision that they have to investigate on this server which is hosting these services. Have you ever thought that this is a very complicated issue? If we have like embassies in the physical world, and police has to behave totally different when they enter an embassy. They are no more the master of the location. Now, we have not thought about public services, governmental services in cloud, and legal interception and law enforcement measures. That is an unsolved situation. We need a concept. Otherwise, in the physical world, it will be like war. In the electronic world, we don't have any perception of this, and this is just one of the problems which is hardly ever addressed to. We addressed it at some specific events with the European Commission and with member states, but this is a severe thing, and this is one of the reasons that up to now, I'm not aware of any European government using cloud services for imperial services, which means for services which are not, like administrating things which are basically private sector, but which are crucial, like medical, like who is in my country, like criminal records, fiscal records, etc., etc., because that might be quite a challenge to do so. Jurisdiction matters with liability. Users need to keep control and possibly have a choice. So I possibly don't want to receive mails from a Corinthian server which go through Brazil for obvious reasons. And if you look into what happens, like in phishing and banking, etc., etc., that's exactly the situation. You have people who are sitting possibly very nearby, but they are making a little detour, an electronic detour, to gray out the legal situation, and then you can't follow up. Now imagine if you had this information, what jurisdiction it went through in your packets. You would find products like emails, services that tell you, do you really want from an unknown situation to open executables? You will have banks will say, well, you have to use this perimeter, this security perimeter, to be able to do transactions above a certain limit of above a certain amount. Well, we could approach that in many ways. We could think with the providers, and you don't need all of them at once. We could think with the providers to introduce, like, it's only like 2 or 3 bits. It's like it's in the same country, it's in the EU, it's in a let's quote friendly environment, or it's unknown. And you can view that not only from the EU side, you can view that from the US side, from the Chinese side. It's always the same number of information. Adding two bits of information to each packet would not be a great thing. It would be, from the standardization, quite an effort, because it takes time. Takes time so that all protocol stakes work up. But we can do other things like compulsory security suites with DNSSEC and TLS, using client-side certificates that would already augment to a great extent. Now, probably you've thought into why does that not happen? A few years ago, we spoke even in the press about ACTA. Some of you certainly remember that discussion. And if you look into that piece, which in some countries has been reflected into legislation in one or the other way, this exactly contradicts DNSSEC. And we're using that all the time. Well, if you're in a big company, if you're in an administration, what you do, you gate your information at the entry. You rewrite the certificate to be able to look for malware, basically. But this is a tool which also breaks your identity chain, which, if used on the wrong spot, can do a lot of harm. And we have to balance these things in an appropriate way. We need to assign proper responsibilities. We have experienced that in the banking situation. We are now in the situation, if you're using the Maestro card, up to a certain level the bank is responsible, which makes it very clear that the bank will do everything they can that the thing is secure. And we have to see similar approaches also when it comes to liability in cloud and in communication. Certainly you have seen this is around a long time already, this Dublin situation where Microsoft was asked by the US administration to deliver data which is held in Europe and only concerns European clients. They were asked to deliver that to US for legal reasons. And interestingly enough, that is, from the point of view of US, perfectly legal. If you are a US company or a company which has a major interest in the US legislation and law enforcement can ask you to provide information even if this information is held outside the US. And it comes a little more tricky. You as a service provider are not allowed to tell your client that this happens. So if you now imagine company X, which is a US company, they have a service, a cloud service, which is run in the EU, and now you have a government service which is using that cloud service, and you combine what I've said just over the last minutes, then you see it's just a no-go to use that service, because that is the perfect perfect Snowden effect, if you so wish. Now, we have worked together. Legislation are incompatible. Legislation, even in one and the same country, are in some cases incompatible, but there you can set priorities. When it comes to international legislation, you cannot easily set priorities. You cannot agree on priorities, which legislation prevails. So information technology is asked to do something that we do not get into conflict with this legislation. And one of the major things which has to be addressed, already had to be addressed in the past, and is not appropriately addressed, to my view, is communication and trust in cloud services. It's coming up at my institute in Graz. We have a cooperation with one company. I'm not mentioning this. They have a product out there. And we have discussed that with Microsoft. I was in Redmond a few weeks ago with the appropriate people, and they are thinking to offer similar services within their Asia cloud. Now, what I'm talking about, we have situations where we want to use cloud from the point of view of administration, from the point of view of SMEs. It's very important because SME themselves, they are not able to secure their environments. They are much better off, even security-wise, using cloud than if they would do it their own. We want to use cloud in education because of commercial effects. We want to use bring your own device, etc., etc. And each of these buzzwords has lots of security holes. Why that? The basic reason is all these things are bottom-up designed. They're designed for commodity products, for entertainment products, and then they are a little bit pepped up to meet some of the requirements. We didn't have that when you go back like 20 years. We had the mainframes, we were shrink down, you had everything on a mainframe, you could imagine those times. And you said, well, I don't need that, and it makes cheaper, and then I use it on the desktop, where have you environment. Now it's totally the reverse. You have a mobile phone, Android version 2, which has no security at all, and then you think, well, that's not so good, you have to add this and that. And obviously, we had a very nice talk about design. This is nothing in terms of design. Design is you think and then you build. And the way we're doing that is you build and then you think. And that's the wrong way around. Now, we have to live with this situation, which means we have to rely to a minimum on device properties. We have to avoid this. We have to avoid the local processing as much as we can. We know that thousands of mobile phones and mobile devices are lost each year in taxis, in airports. They are mixed up. You are in a rush and you have an iPad. The next one has an iPad. You just grab an iPad and say, "Oh, that was not mine." And all that is security issues, because that iPad could have keys on it, and if that in this situation, it's not really a big risk, because the probability that the one who gets it just by chance is not too big. But lost devices or stolen devices is a risk, and you must make sure that this is not something which harms your total environment. Now, if I have the key of my office on my device and I lose that device, all other people of my office are concerned. Now, the only way to do that is to separate security services, which is most probably only 1%, 2%, 3% of all the processing you have, but it has specific value, it has specific needs, and you can't just mix it up. To separate this from cloud, to separate this from your normal processing in an appropriate way, and to have it in a proper environment. Protocols and mechanisms are needed there. If you look under the password key vault in the Azure cloud, you will see something which goes towards this direction, and I got the promise that over the next half year or so, they will offer this protocol also to be used outside, towards the outside. Now, why is cryptography so complicated? First, it usually influences convenience and usability. So people refrain, if you go to a person in my age and they want to reach out, I don't have grandchildren, but if they want to reach out to their grandchildren, they will not ask, is the communication secure? They will say, hey, this is a way to get there, I will do it, no matter what happens, and then they will see what really happens. You have on the other side national interests, which sometimes come with things like drilling holes into the security system for purposes, which is a bad thing, because if you drill holes, somebody will find the holes. We have the handling complexity, and we have the research which is asked. We all know about homomorphic cryptography. It's a nice thing. It can serve many purposes. It's just not practical. If you combine the two words, homomorphic cryptography and cloud, you will end up with local processing, because it's much cheaper. You need so much computing that it doesn't compensate the advantage of new setups. And there we have to work. It will be there. I'm fairly convinced we will have mechanisms that work, but it need not be homomorphic cryptography, but we will have mechanisms that work, that secure our environments. I'm fairly convinced that this, even if your wave no, you find it in some areas, like Salesforce is using that for doing comparisons, but it's only a very, very limited area. Cost efficiency, I already mentioned. And at the end, what we need is security and cryptography under control of the user, under control of, if it's administration, under national control. So that's the two things we have to end up with. And here we have a lot of gaps. If you think about the implementation of a product, if you think about the product cycle, you have the innovation, someone has a good idea, you bring it to a product. There's a lot of interest of industry to shorten that time. You have regulation about that. You cannot do everything you want. The industry had a lot of interest that the regulation is in place and can be applied so that they can address the broad market. And then you have standardization. You have no one whose interest is in having a short period between the regulation and the open standard. Because what does it mean, the lack of open standards? Lack of open and available standard means that the one who has a proprietary solution can deploy it to a higher price than it could do it otherwise. So the user has to be assisted in that situation somehow. When it comes to cloud and risk, we also have a changed situation. Normally you have your internal system with all the firewalls, what have you. That's obsolete with cloud. Why should you have a firewall? Your data are not with you, they're somewhere else. But what people do not realize, that the whole deployment cycle, that the whole provisioning cycle is also over the internet. So what has not been the case previously we had all that intramura. And now we are doing that from external. We're doing that with user ID password and probably not thinking about that. Especially small companies are doing that to a great extent because they get offered these services in a very interesting way. And if you have observed the price evolution of cloud services, you've seen it's not getting cheaper, it's getting more expensive to some extent. Because it was, a very low entry price to attract people, and as you have them, you can build on that. You have to be very conscious about these things. What about innovation and digital sovereignty? 3 minutes. Okay, I was thinking it was 45, but I will finish up in 3 minutes. No problem. No problem. No, it's no problem. I will handle. No problem. I will focus on things I think they are important, and I'll skip some slides. No problem. Think about the situation of the Merkel phone. This phone. There was many rumors about that. The Merkel phone, which is the encrypted phone, was not intercepted, was not broken at all. But the company who did that was sold for 100 million euros to Canada. And Germany could not, they spoke with them again and again, they could not make any effort to prevent from that. Now, it's a good thing, they're making money, but if you think from that, from a sovereignty point of view, from a industry policy point of view, Europe is sponsoring the innovation, then we don't have the industry to take up. We have to think about that. We need a pool of industry that takes up these services, and there are many of such examples which are just sold out because they are small startup which is happy to have 100 million euro. But if you think about that in the whole life cycle, it's not a good thing. Oops, sorry, that was the wrong one. And that has to do with the situation that we are spreading out, we are polarizing. The systems are done in US, hardware is done in Far East. What remains for Europe? Probably data protection, security, applications, sovereign, these more subtle things which are not so much focused on the other side. And there we have to focus to remain under control. I have mentioned already, and this is an easy way to shorten the span down. I have mentioned already this evolution towards document collaboration. In 3 or 5 years' time, we all will have Office 365, Google Docs, or such like, because it will be ways cheaper than all the other stuff we get around, and it's available on any devices, etc., etc. That's tempting, but what remains is continuity. You cannot switch from one to the other. Have you tried to use a Google Docs file in a genuine way and to open it Office 365? No way. The other way around is because of the spread out of Office easier. They just do it. But that's a lock-in situation we have to be very aware of, because the lock-in situation again is the price dependability. And many ministries today are paying hundreds of thousands of euros in extra for the same licenses they had previously, because license agreements slightly change and twist. And that's going to happen here as well. We have no standards. We need a standard for this, and we need a standard that allows one situation, that allows the situation that we have one key per document. You cannot prevent someone who had the document that he remembers that he has it, but we must prevent this person, if he leaves the company, to access other documents, to have the key for other documents. So we have to have, in the first place, one key per document. In the second place, we have to have identity-based keys, not knowledge-based keys. So the keys are not in your device. You identify someone. You never get the key. You only get the key for a session. And that is important, because then you only get the version of the document which you already had, so that there's no leakage of information. And we have to work strictly towards that. And it's a complicated issue in protocols. It's not unfeasible. You could build it into Office 365. I have delivered a 2-page document to Microsoft how to do that, and we are in constant discussion with them, up to Scott Charney, who is the head of security. But the RV to do this is very limited at these companies, as you can imagine. Now, to sum up, what we have done, and it's only 2 slides more, so I'm keeping in your time frame. We have solved calendar, we have solved mail in terms of standards, we have solved documents to some extent, we can use SMIME. We have not solved collaboration as yet. We have a huge number of other discussion elements, like TTIP. Will this puzzle fit? If you look at that, it's not so sure. But we certainly need a closer look to that. My last slide, security always is strengths times take-up. If you have a very strong system and nobody's using that, it's nice, but it's unuseful. If you have everyone using a weak mechanism, you have lost as well. If you miss out on one, you lose. If you lose on this formula, we lose the game. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, Moshe Wadi, please.
I'd like to address the ethics issue, because I see a tremendous gap between the kind of thing we've been hearing on one hand and what's happening on the educational front. So, for example, in the ACMI curricula, there's always a required course in ethics, and you just cannot find faculty members to teach it. They say, well, ethics, what do I know about ethics? I'm a computer scientist. That should be left to the philosophy department. It's very, very difficult to get this seriously taught by computer scientists. So the reality is that I think when you look at the education, we have a huge gap, and I would like to hear some ideas of how we close that gap.
Yeah, please.
You're absolutely right. This is a huge problem, and so we in Delft, we hire people with 2 backgrounds, preferably in the philosophy group. So we want engineers with a philosophy education, or philosophers with, at least a bachelor or a master's in one of the engineering disciplines or applied sciences. And this is exactly where we need to be, but these are rare creatures to be found. But I think teaching ethics requires those those skills and those sets of background knowledge, and then we get to exactly what you showed. You demonstrated a lot of those examples where we have moral discussion about a design. All of the the slides, especially the last 10s, you had proposals to do a good job, and these can be discussed by pointing your finger. Actually, I would disagree. I would do this a little bit different. Or people would come in and say, well, actually, have you thought about that? So these are perfect examples of the nature, but these require both technical knowledge, but at the same time you know, some versatility and background in kind of analyzing these notions like security and informed consent and privacy and autonomy of users and how they hang together. So, but don't leave it dangling up there, but bring it down to these kind of detailed designs, and then to go back again and say, actually, what does it mean for our European conception of privacy or data protection? Can we, you know, what to do with this notion of informed consent that is still, or personal data? You know, all of these are very high-level conceptual, almost philosophical notions, and so we need that shuttling back and forth, which require exactly the creatures, the hybrid creatures that have one leg in the philosophy department and another. So the other thing, you know, I noticed that in Japan they're trying to get rid of their humanities and their social sciences. They're closing down all of the, I mean, that's the proposal on the table in Japan. Yeah. And I can see that people are getting a little bit tired of the philosophers kind of, you know, so this is also a criticism I have of many of my colleagues. They're just, they like to think of themselves as the, you know, the 21st century versions of Wittgenstein and Nietzsche and so on. But they're not, they could do such wonderful work if they just could bring themselves to address some of the urgent, huge problems that we're confronted with. And so it's okay to study Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, and we need a couple of people to do that, but large parts of them should dedicate themselves also to studying this and qualify themselves to teach ethics to the engineers as well.
I would partly agree. You know, my example is also, if you want to climb up a high mountain, you don't necessarily go upwards. Sometimes you have to go down first. So you need also this very conceptual, very long visionary without a low-hanging fruit. So the mixture is the importance.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I always say that the philosophers do not have anything to bring if they don't go back to the resources, the deeper resources that you do that in order to be of value.
Okay. Hannes Wertner, then Carlo Gezzi.
Thanks for your presentations. And also the first question was on how to do it, okay? But is there a limit what we can do? Because this was the first principle of Bertrand, no? There's this principle of life. And how far can this go, or how far should we look at that? For example, a concrete example, should we do projects with the army industry, for example, with the weapon industry? So what you were is somehow, it's how we do it and what are principles and how to look at it and things, but is there some limit of things to do, or is there absolute freedom of research? Combined with that, is there an institutional mechanism at universities or funding agencies to look at those issues, or do we need it? Thanks.
That's okay. Another question. Okay.
Yeah, the question of limits is very important. It's difficult for people who teach a subject to accept that it has boundaries. But for example, in requirements engineering, in software, one of the first things we teach to students, at least in good courses about requirements, is to say that one of the tasks of requirements is to scope the system, to say where the system stops. And this is a very general rule. So I try to push this point that not everything is ethical. And you know, I mentioned this paper on the ethics of free software. My conclusion then, which really irked many people, was that the choice between free software and commercial software is not has nothing to do with ethics. It's a business decision. And I think if you start doing this kind of thing, if you start saying, well, this is important and this is ethical, this is not ethics, then you may have a much better clue as to what really we should teach.
I do not completely agree with this last remark, if I may just, I mean, so it's just a business, or this is just business, this is this is not a public thing. You know, sometimes we have decided that some things are so important in our societies that we have taken them away out of the business world and the market. And we said, you know, actually, patient safety or food safety or aviation safety is too important to leave to commercial parties to scrutinize and investigate this. We will have government agencies to do this, because there's clearly not a for-profit motive, and it cannot be the quality and their ideas about quality cannot be compromised by commercial incentives. So that's one thing. Your question, yeah, I think we need, as universities, we need to take our responsibility here, and we're trying together, for example, with CESAR, the Association of 60 Technical Universities, and I think Technical University of Vienna is also a part of that, to come together and to exchange experiences in teaching ethics, and to see. Also, to get together and see whether there are limits to what we can do. Of course, we all know about the people who are concerned about artificial intelligence and deep learning and etc. This becomes really practical. For example, because the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and the UN is getting to the experts in the universities to help them think about autonomous systems. And what it is now in the UN talks about meaningful human control over high-tech systems that exemplify high levels of autonomy, especially when armed payloads can be attached to them. And of course, this is the drone discussion. There's a lot of thinking about that. A lot of people are very concerned about this. So in Geneva, we had discussions about cluster munition, about eye-blinding lasers, about dum-dum bullets. So this is the next generation of highly intelligent systems. And this is maybe one of those limits, kind of AI, advanced deep learning to those things. Systems that could say, actually, you like this target, you may also like that target, like, advising us to buy books on Amazon.
Yeah, so I think, in the case of free software, I really think the choice is between business models. But it certainly doesn't mean that everything is, saying that not everything is ethical doesn't mean that everything is business. And I completely agree with you that business interests and market interests are overreaching and being taken into account in areas where they are not. So we need to have a good balance. But let me take an example, another example in which I think in that case it is business. So shortly after the Snowden affair broke out, I had a conversation at a conference with Windsurf, and there were other people in that conversation. There was no indication that it was private or anything, so I can repeat his comment. So I asked him the rather staple question, with what we know now, would you, if you were sysadmin for the French or German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, would you buy a Cisco router? Okay. So he did not answer my question, but he said something very interesting. He said, well, there's something I don't understand. Why are the Europeans making all this noise and not starting a cloud, offering a big cloud company of their own? Okay. And then much of what we discussed would go away. And it's so, in that case, I think it's really, in the end, it's a business model. I mean, instead of being in panels, some of us should actually go and start a company and do it. So in this case, I think it's really, it is going to be a market solution, and we can have all the speeches we want. It's not going to affect the situation very much, as long as we have the choice between Amazon Cloud, Microsoft Cloud, and Google Cloud.
Okay, Carlo Gezzi.
Well, I would have many questions, but I would like to go back to the issue of, having ethics as part of the education, and which goes back to the question that Moshe was asking before. And I would like to start from here. When we graduate our students, at least in my university, we read at the end a very nice statement about what it means to be an engineer. And I happen to be the oldest faculty, so I had to read this very nice piece of prose to our students. And what it basically says is that, you're an engineer, and the essence of the engineer is to be able to apply ethical behaviors in your profession. And it occurred to me that in 5 years, we don't tell them anything about this. But in the end, we read this very nice statement in which we say that this is the essence of being an engineer. So, I really believe that there should be a way to touch on these issues, while they sit in the university. So perhaps, one of the good, important things that we can do is to start collecting examples, where this is done, how this is done, what is a good way or an effective way of starting this. I believe that this is as a community should be one of the important things for us to do, because it's becoming more and more important. We had several examples. Bertrand had a long list initially. He didn't tell us what was the what was ethical and not ethical. But our students are day by day facing the issue, and we have to find a way to do it.
Okay, Gregor Engel, you want to follow up here? Okay.
Maybe it's more or less the same topic as Carlo was saying. I think what we have done not right in the last 20 years is that we were sticking a lot on our computer science core discipline. We didn't look into the applications. And if you start to look into applications, and I do it at the moment, I speak with people who are really using our systems, and they look into the people who are using the systems. They look into also in the business models, and what does it mean, how to make money, but they also look into the human aspect. When we spoke about the human aspect in computer science, we spoke about the user interface of a nice system. But we didn't speak about what does it mean for the users who are using the system in their current life. And I think it doesn't make sense at the end of 5 years to read this statement. We have to bring the students together with the people in the application domains during the study. And we have to then discuss pros and cons of using a system in their context. So I think we should be more open to other disciplines.
Okay, who's the first?
Well, I think we have a very efficient metric for the business case, which is money. And that drives our minds and that drives the society in a very interesting way. We're observing that more and more governance is shifting from society to companies because of that metrics. I think we need a metric for the other principle that matters. It's very good to have a nice statement, but you need a metric that matters, that you can see that it has an impact. And we have to work towards that in ethics, and also in terms of design. We also have these nice phrases. You have design, data security and privacy by design. But if you talk to those people who introduced that, I talked to Peter Hustings several times personally, and then he says, well, it's a nice word, we don't know what it means.
Well, yeah, there are examples. Do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
There are examples, of course, in the area of sustainability. So we've been for 30 years been claiming that this is green or sustainable, etc. And we had the same kind of reaction to that. That's all very nice, but it may as well be greenwashing. Please show us, demonstrate how you have handled and dealt with this. So, and the same with safety on the work floor. It's nice that you, as a CEO, you advertise that you've done a good job. Can you show us what you've done? So there are good examples of how to do that, how to integrate it into your corporation, into your business processes, into your reporting, so I think we should be looking, we will be looking in the next decades to how to do that for IT. And the Volkswagen case is a very important, where we realize not only in automotive, but also in finance and in healthcare, there is so much software under the hood, literally, that we don't understand, and the people themselves don't understand, the users don't understand. So we're sitting duck, basically, for the next thing to,
When it comes to the commercial metrics, then it matters. That's the Volkswagen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, addressing briefly both Carlo's and Gregor Engel's questions, and also in a matter about teaching. As others have mentioned before, we need help from our colleagues in the humanities. Now, the term philosopher for me connotes someone who is chain smoking cigarettes in a cafe in the Latin Quarter, explaining the meaning of life to a group of adoring young women. And these kinds of philosophers. So those are not going to. I hope you're right, and those were the days. I'm not absolutely sure, depending on the country. And I think those kinds of philosophers don't have very much to offer to us. On the other hand, I would say, without pandering to my neighbor on my right, I think your kind of philosophy is very close in spirit to the kind of things we do in science and engineering. And you address issues, real issues, and you try to provide answers. And so it seems to me that in terms of teaching, we should be relatively modest. We should scope what we do, and we should be problem-oriented once more. If you sit down with students and examine the kinds of practical questions, you are an engineer at Volkswagen, well, what do you do? And then it's much more effective than preaching to them, which doesn't work very well.
Any other comment? Frank van Hamelen?
So my favorite definition of philosophers are old guys with no data. Right? So I think we can here do a little bit of philosophy with data. Right? So you can actually give an empirical and even experimental slant to this and challenge our students. Give two designs of this security protocol, right, and discuss the ethical implications. So I think there is a real opportunity here now to make this very concrete and very almost empirical. And I think that's maybe something that was lacking in the traditional curricula that are also present at my university. We're no better than anybody else.
Yeah, this design turn, the book is going to be published next year. It's about the design turn in practical ethics. So ethics has come a long way. First it was theoretical, it's very philosophical, done by the people you kind of accurately described, and it's become really applied. Let's say it's about human rights and about medical ethics and business ethics in some decades ago, and now it is becoming even more helpful and practical by looking at design. So I think it's a notable shift, and I think that is exactly what is needed. And so I'll be all in favor of kind of a concerted effort to put this on the European agenda, because that is what is needed.
Just to interject a citation from Professor Helmut Veit, who is sitting in the back, to describe that other kind of philosophy. He used in a recent discussion the definition of science by neologism. I think that's what it is, and that's we don't want.
Carlo, just a remark by me. I think it's very
I wanted to make a comment that, you have been insisting, for example, that you have to spend time on requirements and understanding what are the ethical aspects that should then inform your design. This is, of course, there is no question that this should be done. Although, today, for example, our students follow design methodologies that actually teach that you shouldn't spend so much time on these upfront activities. So I think that this is probably a good point, that we can use to show what are the pros and cons of certain design approaches. So this, on the other hand, I would also like to remark that it is also true that for some of the systems that we are building, it's very hard upfront to understand what are the ethical implications. So these are kind of emerging afterwards. So again, another kind of perhaps good way of attacking these principles with our students.
Now, this latter point is a very important one. It has a name. It's on on the risk of looking to solve problems by introducing neologisms, but this is Collingridge's dilemma. And that's Collingridge's dilemma. He was the first to point out, not specifically to IT, but anything you design, is that when you start to design, you have all degrees of freedom. You're starting, but you have no information about how it will, affect the users or affect the world. Once you are it into the world, your degrees of freedom kind of diminish, but then you're getting the feedback of how it works out. But you have to find a certain optimum where you say, well, I can still make some changes, but I'm getting some useful feedback on,